Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, president of El Monitor, and our guests this week are El Monitor's Washington correspondents Elizabeth Hagedorn, Adam Lucente, and Jared Szuba. We will be talking about what the Biden administration can expect and what we should expect from the Biden administration and the next Congress in dealing with the Middle East, including policies toward Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, human rights in the region, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and more. Now, let me kick off by saying that the Middle East prospects will depend in good part on its economic resilience coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and low oil prices, which are projected to end up at about $41 per barrel this year and estimated to be $46 per barrel or so in 2021 next year. And that's according to the International Monetary Fund. Now, $46 is a drop of almost 25% from $61 per barrel in 2019. The indicators show that the Middle East North Africa economy is going to contract by about 5% this year, and that's half a point more than the IMF projects for the global economy, which is expected to decrease by 4.4%. Now, next year, 2021, just around the corner, the Middle East and North Africa is expected to grow by 3.2%, but that trails again the global economic projection of 5.2% economic growth. As the MENA region had only a 0.8% growth rate in 2019, we are looking at cumulatively 3 difficult years. Now, the reasons for the projected lower growth rates include deep structural problems that have gone from bad to worse as a result of the pandemic. And among them are the wars and their consequences in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, civil unrest in Iraq, Lebanon, and Algeria, continued hardship for Gaza, and economic crises that predate the pandemic, including heavy indebtedness, high unemployment among young people, and legacies of corruption, inefficiencies, and poor governance throughout the region. Now, our guests today include El Monitor correspondents Elizabeth Hagedorn, Jared Szuba, and Adam Lucente. Elizabeth covers Mideast policymaking in Washington and breaking news. She previously reported on the region as a freelance journalist in Turkey and Iraq for Middle East Eye, The National, The Guardian, and other publications. Jared is El Monitor's Pentagon correspondent. He previously worked for the Defense Post here in Washington and also reported on the region from Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. And he also was an editor at Aram Online in Cairo. And Adam covers breaking news in the Congress for El Monitor. He has worked in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Tunisia, and other countries across the Middle East. My conversation with Elizabeth Hagedorn, Jared Szuba, and Adam Lucente begins now. Elizabeth, Jared, Adam, welcome to On the Middle East. Jared, let's start with you. You cover the Pentagon. The Trump administration's been cautious about the use of force in the region and has actually called for a scaling back of the U.S. commitment, drawing down troops in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, for that matter. What do you expect from a Biden administration, which is inheriting this strategic landscape? And would the Biden administration continue this overall trend to step back from what some call endless wars?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me. Well, I think there are a few things going on there. I think, President Trump has been consistent since his campaign days that he wanted U.S. military involvement in the Middle East and other parts of the world to wrap up. And I think it's important to back up here and note that, as has been noted by a number of U.S. officials, particularly at the Pentagon, that how warfare is being conducted is really changing. The United States obviously adopted the new national defense strategy in 2018, and this is really, going to be the greatest U.S. strategic shift since the end of the Cold War, at least. This is obviously an effort to push back on Russia and China's expanding overseas influence. And I think it's not fully clear how the Biden administration is going to see the Middle East fitting into that. So a lot of that's going to depend on the diplomatic end of how the the Biden administration deals with Iran moving forward, and how they want to negotiate some sort of return to the JCPOA or some sort of new deal. And I think one of the biggest issues that is going to come up with that is how they work with the issue of Iran's ballistic missile program.
Elizabeth, I wanted to get to you next. Biden has referred to Saudi Arabia as a pariah and has said that the kingdom will need to pay a price for some of its actions. How do you think a Biden administration will handle the balance between human rights and security interests in the kingdom, but more broadly in the Middle East? It's always a challenge. And for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's still a key player in dealing with Iran and counterterrorism in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy and ending the war in Yemen. What changes do you expect, if any, in how one manages U.S. diplomacy towards Saudi Arabia?
That's a good question. I think striking that balance will certainly be a challenge for this next administration. Generally speaking, we will see a greater focus on human rights in Biden's foreign policy. And with Saudi Arabia, we have some idea of what this will look like. During the campaign, Biden pledged to end U.S. military support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, a country the United Nations says is experiencing the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And, the U.S. is currently providing logistical support and intelligence to the Saudis, whose bombing campaign rights groups say is responsible for many civilian casualties. In addition to ending military support in Yemen, there will also be pressure on Biden to halt arms sales to the kingdom. And then with Jamal Khashoggi, Biden has said he will seek accountability for his murder. President Trump resisted congressional efforts to punish the kingdom. And the activists are hopeful that, at the very least, the administration will release the new administration will release the classified intelligence assessment into who was responsible. And then another area of concern for the Biden team, I think, are going to be the political prisoners held in Saudi Arabia, several of whom are U.S. citizens and jailed on trumped-up charges. So we'll likely see greater pressure on Riyadh there. But as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia is a country with long-standing economic and military ties to the United States. Its de facto ruler is in his 30s and will likely be at the helm for many more decades. So despite Biden's harsh rhetoric, he's not promising, a major disruption of this decades-old relationship. We will, however, see a shift in tone, one in which Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, for example, won't be invited to the Oval Office for photo ops.
What about more broadly? Obviously, this is a region where human rights, unfortunately, is not as well respected as it is in the West. It's often, if not always, been a sticking point in many of Washington's key relationships, not just with Saudi Arabia, but also with Egypt, for example. How do you see the Biden administration, based upon what we know about Senator and Vice President Joe Biden's engagement in the Middle East and what we're seeing from the campaign and key foreign policy leaders who will also be part of setting that foreign policy agenda?
Right. Well, critics of the Trump administration would say that the current White House does promote human rights, but only selectively, going after egregious abusers like Iran, but giving more of a pass to countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, whose leaders Trump has embraced. I think the hope among human rights groups and progressive activists is that this next administration will, at the very least, provide some clarity on what is not acceptable behavior from U.S. partners and allies. To go back to the Khashoggi example, you saw a lot of mixed messages from the White House that critics would argue led Mohammed bin Salman to believe he could act with impunity. And it's worth noting, Biden says he wants to host a summit of democracies during his first year in office to confront nations that are backsliding on human rights. And, a number of Middle East countries would probably fall into that category.
Adam, you cover the Congress. The Senate, as we have our conversation today, is still up for grabs pending the outcome of the runoff elections in Georgia on January 5th. What changes do you expect on Middle East policy, if any? And tell us about the new chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. That's obviously a big job in terms of Middle East policy. That's Congressman Meeks.
Yeah, thank you. So in the Senate, there's a few things to watch for next year. I think there could be some changes on arms sales to the UAE in particular. As our readers know, as Senators Bob Menendez, Chris Murphy, and Rand Paul, they introduced legislation to block the Trump administration's weapon sale to the UAE of F-35 fighter jets and drones and other weapons. The resolutions went to vote this month. They did not pass. However, what could happen in the Senate next year is arms sales, they take years to deliver typically. And Senator Murphy, who co-introduced the resolutions, he said almost immediately after the resolution to block the sale failed, he said that he wants to continue reviewing these weapon sales to the UAE when Biden comes into office. So it's possible the state of the sale could change. Another thing to watch for is resistance to President-elect Biden's Iran policy from Senate Republicans. An Obama administration official I spoke to said this is what Republicans are most likely to challenge Biden on, which is Iran, and specifically any attempt he makes to return to the nuclear deal. The Senate, it's important to note, it's not totally split by party on the issue of Iran and the nuclear agreement, which is important considering how close the Senate will be in terms of Democrats versus Republicans. Menendez and also Chuck Schumer are Democrats who voted against the Iran nuclear agreement in 2015. Paul, kind of an anti-war Republican, he voted against it, but he's with the Democrats on some other issues. So I do think there will be pushback on any rapprochement Biden tries to make with Iran from Republicans in the Senate, but how any votes will go, it's unclear because some people will vote against their party. And the final thing to watch for in the Senate is Biden's cabinet confirmations. Could be some resistance from Senate Republicans. Secretary of State is, of course, the position that's most related to the Middle East. And Biden's nominee, Tony Blinken, in my view, is safer for confirmation than Susan Rice would have been because of Benghazi in that controversy. The process is moving along with Blinken. He met with Senators Coons and Booker already, so I think he could get confirmed. But before I go to the House, just the important thing to point out is the Georgia runoff elections in January. A lot of what happens in the Senate and regarding the Middle East depends on what happens there. The polls are very tight. For people just to remember that if the Democrats pick up both seats, it'll be 48-48, but Vice President Harris would be the tiebreaker in that. So it would effectively give Democrats a very narrow control margin if they win both Georgia elections. But if the Republicans just win one of them, then it will be a slight Republican majority in the Senate. And then, as you said, there is a new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Eliot Engel was defeated by Jamal Bowman. He was the longtime chair of that committee. So now Gregory Meeks, another Democratic representative from New York, will chair the committee in the next Congress. He has a fairly standard voting record in terms of Democrats. He was for the Iran deal. He voted against the Iraq war. When he was selected as chair, he got support from a few different wings of the party that are notable. The pro-Israel Democratic Majority for Israel, which supports pro-Israel policies for Democrats, they endorsed him as chair, said they're excited to work with him. He also got support when he became chair from J Street, which is a pro-Israel, pro-peace organization that's kind of a liberal, more pro-peace counter to AIPAC, the main Israel lobby group. At a December hearing with Joel Rayburn from the State Department, Congressman Meeks said that he was disappointed Trump turned Syria over to Russia. So these were one of his final remarks at a hearing to close the year. So maybe you'll see more support for the Kurdish cause and for the SDF in Syria under his chairmanship.
Adam, you talk about Iran, and I want to bring Jared and Elizabeth back in on this. And interesting point you just made, that the Senate, not just Republicans, but perhaps some Democrats as well, could challenge various aspects of engagement with Iran. Jared, in terms of those you deal with, including on the military and more defense side, is there a feeling that Iran has gained in the region in terms of its influence in what they call malign activity over the last 3 or 4 years? Or has the Trump policy of maximum pressure served to contain Iran by cutting off funding that could have gone to Hezbollah and other proxy groups? What are you picking up on the success of maximum pressure and how the threat from Iran is read in the region?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there's been some optimism or optimistic assessments, I should say, on, I know you asked about the defense side, but particularly on the State Department side, we saw, we've seen in the past couple of weeks, people, Ambassador James Jeffrey, former Syria envoy, and his successor, Joel Rayburn, have said in the past couple of weeks publicly, including in our interview with Ambassador Jeffrey, that the U.S. goal to the U.S. officially has a goal of pushing Iranian-backed forces out of Syria, preventing Iran from establishing a power projection presence in Syria which they could use potentially to threaten Israel with a new front using rocket and ballistic missile capabilities. The State Department people are come across publicly as very confident that this is not going to be accomplished, and they credit U.S. military and intelligence support for Israel's air campaign in Syria, obviously, for helping to tamp that down. Now, I think I think some of those are somewhat rosy interpretations. I mean, the official U.S. policy is that Iranian forces should leave Syria, and we saw last week, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy, publicly saying that he sees no reason why the Iranians would at this time leave Syria. You see Iranian leadership saying that they're not going to do it. And you have Ambassador Jeffrey in the same event with Mulroy basically publicly admitting that, yes, we have a maximalist position that they should leave, but what we really want is to prevent them from establishing, a military forward presence in Syria, and that at least has been successful. So there's been mixed results. Obviously, not all the U.S. goals have been achieved, but there is a good deal of optimistic interpretation of the developments over the last 3 to 4 years, particularly with regards to how the U.S. has addressed this issue in Syria. I think in Iraq, there have been more questions. We've seen Secretary Pompeo obviously sent that threatening letter warning that if the Iraqi authorities do not rein in the attacks of Iran-linked militias, that the U.S. may have to respond unilaterally and more forcefully. So I think the results have been mixed, but I think there is quite a bit of there is some satisfaction among some U.S. officials who have worked on this.
Elizabeth, Joe Biden has said he wants to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal if Iran is in compliance, and Iran wants the U.S. back in the deal, or that's what they seem to be saying at this point. The price of readmission is the U.S. lifting sanctions imposed since the Trump administration withdrew from the deal in May 2018. Now, some of those sanctions are on persons and entities affiliated with the IRGC, Hezbollah, and other Iran proxies. That lifting those sanctions could be hard to justify. How do you see the Biden administration handling the issue of sanctions? Some have said they should indeed be used as leverage in the opening of engagement with Iran. And how do you see U.S. policy toward Iran playing out once the new administration takes office?
We've seen a new round of sanctions against Iranian targets just about every week since the election. I think it remains to be seen how they will impact future negotiations with Iran. Critics see the sanctions pile-on as an effort to tie Biden's hands. On the flip side, you can also imagine how an easing of sanctions could provide Biden with some bargaining power to bring Iran, which has suffered under U.S. sanctions, to the negotiating table. We were talking about human rights. This is also an incoming administration that's pledged to elevate human rights in its foreign policy with, you had Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who will be Biden's choices for Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, recently weighing in on Iran's gruesome execution of a dissident journalist earlier this month. So I think balancing sanctions relief with these human rights abuses carried out by Iran will be a major challenge. And it's also worth noting that Biden is on the clock here. Iran's moderate president has signaled a willingness to re-enter the agreement as a means of getting the sanctions relief, but he leaves office in June, and there are hardliners waiting in the wings who are keen on accelerating the country's nuclear program.
Great point there. Iran has its own domestic pressures and politics, and Rouhani had considered the Iran nuclear deal a great achievement, and it was treated as such until Trump withdrew. So the pressure from the hardliners and Iran, who now control the parliament there, are to stay away from the deal. But you're right. I like that phrase, Biden's on the clock, because Rouhani's days are numbered and that he cannot run for re-election in June. So there will be a new Iranian president. Let me say, as time is running down, we haven't talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I'd like to get you all briefly to talk about that. This has been really an eventful year in many ways. We have the normalization agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan is in the works as well. What do we see for 2021 with the Biden administration coming in? Do we think there'll be an international peace conference? That's something that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has proposed, could have some support at the UN. We had Daoud Khattab here last week. He was not optimistic. One reason is the Biden administration is going to have a lot of other things to do as soon as it takes office, and it could take time to get a conference together. But how do you all see that conflict and that issue playing out in the coming months in the first year of the Biden administration? Adam, do you want to pick it up there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. In this year in Congress, with regards to Israeli-Palestinian, I think in the House in particular, we will see more vocal opposition to any Israel support from the Biden administration. And this is because of shifts in the Democratic Party. As we talked about, Eliot Engel, longtime chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and an ardent Israel supporter, he lost his primary election to Jamal Bowman, who was vocally pro-Palestine. And the members of the so-called squad, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, also very critical of Israel, they won re-election easily. So I don't think this will translate into any U.S. policy changes. Biden, I think, will change rhetoric on Israel, but like his old boss, Barack Obama, I think he'll continue U.S. support for Israel, and I think will keep the embassy in Jerusalem. But more and more, the Democratic Party is shifting towards a more pro-Palestine position. Now, the new chairman Meeks of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he's not really part of this, but eventually I think this will be reflected in the leadership. And I think you'll start to see signs of that from some House Democrats, not all, but some House Democrats in 2021, especially as, with the Black Lives Matter protests and more pro-Palestine views are coming to the forefront in the US. And you can see this in the Democratic platform as well, which in 2020, over the summer, which was clearly against Israeli annexation of the West Bank. So I don't think the leadership will change. I don't think US policy will change so much on Israel, mostly in rhetoric, but I do think some House Democrats will start to be more vocal and more empowered in criticizing US support for Israel.
Thank you. Jared, help us understand what comes next now in terms of the normalization agreements, because these normalization agreements between Israel, and as we mentioned, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, can also have security dimensions, especially in the Gulf, because Israel has had quiet contacts prior to this year about the shared concern with Iran, about Iran's activities in the region. That's something Israel and the Gulf states have shared, their security interests with regard to Iran, who they consider the key threat in the region. Where do you see this going with regard to normalization? Do you think the Biden administration will continue to seek other countries to normalize with Israel, to build upon normalization, to move on the Israeli-Palestinian front? What do you think its options are, and what do you think it will do, if anything, unless you believe, like Daoud does, that they may not just have the time, at least initially, when they come into office?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration is, this is a real splash of cold water for them, right? Because, in the Obama, the Obama administration went out, and a lot of Obama administration officials left 4 years ago at a point in which U.S. and Israel relations were not what they had been in the past. And I think this Trump administration initiative, while the Biden administration, Biden officials will have probably some serious questions about whether or not this is something they want to spearhead right off the bat. There are serious, defense cooperation, security cooperation. And there's an underlayer of strategic cooperation that would really, if it could be pulled off, potentially help the United States and its partners in the region deter Iran, or at least that's the thinking going on in the Trump administration. So the real question is going to be how the Biden administration is approaching Iran. Now, Rouhani has said recently, that Iran is willing to return to the JCPOA as soon as the United States is willing. However, of course, he also mentioned that Iran's ballistic missile program is not going. He signaled that's probably not going to be negotiable as part of a return to the JCPOA or a new agreement. How the Biden administration is going to deal with that is going to be telling about how it carries on or deals with, the legacy of the Abraham Accords. The United States is very closely involved with Israel's missile defense, with the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 system, more recently with the Iron Dome, and of course with the David Sling. The top State Department official dealing with political military affairs has said recently, that the Abraham Accords, the United States would like to see, the Trump administration would like to see, defense cooperation with the Abraham Accords that would enable Israel and the UAE to take, as is clear, a more lead role in deterring Iran's proxy activities in the region. So I think it's really going to come down to how the Biden administration approaches the diplomatic side of the Iran issue.
Elizabeth, one thing that's been interesting about the normalization agreements is that none of the 4 Arab states that have signed on have stepped back from their commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative that was led by Saudi Arabia back in 2002, that the end game is a two-state solution. And when the UAE, which went first with normalization, its condition was that Israel not annex Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which was being talked about at the time, as Jared mentioned. So do you think there could be an Arab initiative to push for a conference or activity on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, or do you see this as being on hold? And I would even ask more broadly, do you see the normalization agreements as a step forward in the long run for the Israeli-Palestinian issue being resolved?
Those are some great questions. I think, Biden has welcomed the initial agreements and indicated that his administration will seek to build on them. The challenge is how to do so while at the same time restoring the damage that was done with Washington's relationship with the Palestinians. I think on the one hand, the Palestinians are probably very encouraged by the new administration after 4 years of Trump. The current administration shut the Palestinian mission in Washington, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and slashed annual aid to the refugee program. Vice President-elect Harris has said the administration will reopen the mission in Washington and restore the aid cuts. But at the same time, Biden isn't going to upend the Israel-U.S. relationship, and building on the Abraham Accords between Israel and Arab countries will not please the Palestinians. I think the big question is, will the regional powerhouse of Saudi Arabia, what will they do? And recent reporting suggests that Saudi Arabia may be waiting to act until the new president takes office. And I think the fear among some progressives is that a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel might come at the cost of Washington giving Riyadh a pass for some of its behavior in the region.
We're just about to wrap up and running out of time, and we've been approaching the issues of the region from a very traditional foreign policy strategic way. You all cover all aspects of the Middle East. We haven't talked about COVID-19. We haven't talked about the economic issues. We haven't talked about many of the development issues, refugees, many things that the region faces that are going to shape the direction of events. Let me just quickly go around to all three of you. If there is one trend in the region that you're watching, that you think we need to be watching and perhaps may not be paying enough attention to, let me know what's on your agenda, what you're looking at in the coming year. And Jared, let's start with you.
That's a tricky one. I mean, I think, I guess off the bat, I would say I would like to see how the Iranian government is going to, what they're going to be willing to have on the table and not amid negotiations with the Biden administration. I think that's going to determine a lot about U.S. Military posture in the region in the next 4 years. So that's something I would definitely be keeping a close eye on: internal Iranian politics and the signals that are being sent by President Rouhani and other leaders.
Adam, what are you watching that perhaps we should be paying more attention to?
One thing I think important to pay attention to is if Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel, if they feel they don't have a total ally in the Biden administration, especially regarding Iran, it will be important to watch what they do, specifically regarding defense cooperation and the further normalization, not Israel and Saudi, but Israel and the UAE, with the further normalization of their relations. Because if they feel that perhaps they can't count on the US to deter Iran, because Biden will take a very different approach than Trump's maximum pressure, maybe they will even further integrate and support each other, moving from just economic and political relations to possibly stronger military relations if they feel threatened by Iran and if they feel the US doesn't see the threat the same way.
Elizabeth?
We've seen a progressive brand of foreign policy in the Democratic Party emerge in recent years. The consensus that was built over ending support for the war in Yemen being really emblematic of that. I'll be watching for the degree to which progressives are represented in Biden's foreign policy team in the weeks to come. His picks so far are pretty mainstream. Their views largely line up with his. I think once we see some of those deputy roles in the State Department and the White House filled out, we'll have a clear picture of Biden's foreign policy vision.
Jared, Elizabeth, Adam, I want to thank you for your time today, your thoughts and observations, and for your great reporting for El Monitor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Andrew.
I will be right back after this short break.
I'm I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I am glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
A great conversation today with Jared Szuba, Elizabeth Hagedorn, and Adam Lucente, and you can read their world-class reporting every day at Al Monitor. Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East, and thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of Al Monitor and Beowulf Roshland of Two Square Media Productions. Wishing you all who are celebrating a Merry Christmas and a wonderful holiday season heading into the new year. We will be back next week, and in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other Al Monitor podcast, On Israel, at your favorite podcast platform.